Good afternoon. This is Joan Young of Sunbelt Business Brokers. Welcome to our Part 2 of the Sellability of Your Business webinar. Hopefully many of you were on our webinar Part 1 last month. And just to let you know, these webinars are part of our exit strategy series that Sunbelt Business Advisors is offering to our clients. And basically the webcast presentations are here to inform business owners so that when the time is right for you to move on to your next venture or retirement, that you're going to be well positioned and educated in order to really maximize what you're walking away with at closing. Sunbelt, by the way, is part of the largest network of business brokerage and mergers and acquisition companies in the world, and our office is in San Jose. I've invited Dale Ratcliffe back to finish our Part 2 series. Dale is one of the key presenters for the Alternative Board, and Dale has a very successful track record of over 30 years in both large companies and entrepreneurial middle market companies. And gosh, I guess Dale, 15 years at B of A, and then you became CFO for 3 different companies, each doing over $20 million.
Right.
And during that, is that right?
Correct.
And then during that time, he managed the acquisition and merger of several companies, as well as the sale of his company to a Fortune 500 company. So, so I think you have the credibility to speak to us today, Dale.
Well, I hope so.
I just wanted to let everybody know that during the webinar, if you would like to ask any questions, just to make sure we don't miss that, there is a chat box on the far left-hand corner, and you can write your questions in, and we'll ask Dale, and we're going to stop after he does a review of the 3 value drivers that we covered in the first webinar. By the way, we are discussing today and last month, John Warlow is the author of Built to Sell, and he built an index to measure the value of your business through value drivers. And we encourage each of you to complete the sellability score that we will be sending to each of you. And I sent it to those who attended last month. Very interesting for you to really get a better look of where your company is strong and what areas need some work. So, Dale, I think you wanted to review a little bit first before we started in our Part 2.
I did. Thank you very much. Welcome to Part 2 this afternoon. I am going to spend a moment or two to go over what we talked about last month for those of you who weren't there, to get a bit of a grounding in what we're talking about as we then progress into the other elements of drivers of value. And for those of you who did attend, it should be a helpful reminder of what we talked about as well. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. The reason we're doing this in the first place is because we're trying to, both Joan and her firm and our firm, work to try to increase your options in terms of going forward in your exit strategies. And whether you're wanting to exit or not, why build value? Well, for one thing, as we're going to shortly see, and if you were with us last month, value is largely driven by profitability, cash flow. And so even if you're not going to sell your company, who doesn't want more cash flow? It could be to build a company for someone who's going to succeed you. It could be a family member or a partner or someone else, or indeed for actually a prospective buyer, a party from unrelated to your company that would like to buy you outright. And we're going to talk about why these 8 drivers will deliver a better price because there will be better perceived value on the part of the buyer. So whether you want to sell today, a year from now, or 5 years from now, really is less relevant than the fact that you want to build value in your company for all of these reasons. So here are the 8 drivers, as Joan referred to them as. We covered the first 3 last month, and I'm going to go briefly over those. I'm doing that partly for, as I said before, for a review, but I'm also doing it because the first 2 are probably the most important of all the drivers. They may not be as important as everything else combined, but financial performance, i.e. the profitability, the cash profile, cash deliverability of your business is probably the number one driver. And then the growth of that profitability, the growth of that cash flow, if you will, is right behind it in terms of how buyers perceive a company, how they are valued. We'll talk about something briefly again called the Switzerland structure. I'll go over that. Then we're going to go into the main content of today, which has to do with the characteristics of cash flow. Is it recurring or not? When is it timed relative to your expenses and so forth, which are very important in terms of valuing a company. Is the revenue, the fifth item, is the revenue recurring or is it one-off? Do you have to get a new customer every time you want to enjoy new revenue? And is it scalable, meaning can you grow it with relative ease without incurring much larger fixed costs? Monopoly control. Can you construct barriers to entry so that you can hopefully extract higher margins, even though you may be a small business, to create some sort of niche? And then, of course, customer satisfaction. Without satisfied customers, acquiring customers is futile if you're losing them at the other end of the process. So customer retention and customer satisfaction are huge, and we're going to spend a moment talking about a way to measure that. And then finally, the hub and spoke, as we call it, concept, which really means, are you the absolute key to the success of the company, or have you built some management depth, a bench, if you will, that can step in and carry on your success if you're not there? So those are the 8 performance drivers, and I encourage you to, at this point, sort of make a note of each of those, because towards the end of this, I'm going to ask you, when the seminar is over, to, on your own, take the time to do an exercise that will help you perhaps get started in thinking more about this for your own company. So, by way of review, we looked at the things that correlate, the factors that correlate in getting what we'll call a premium offer, meaning higher than average for the industry, for the cash flow, and so forth. And at the largest ones at the bottom, and you can see the largest correlation with a premium offer has to do with profitability and its growth. And we talked about that a second ago. And as you work your way up, whether you're in a growing industry, if you have low market share, so you have a lot of room for growth. It's a well-known fact that if you're very large, it's harder to grow fast. And if you're very small, it's much easier. Customer concentration, the recurring revenue we spoke of a moment ago. How big is the company? The 5 times factor, which refers to whether or not you've got to increase your fixed costs, or whether you have excess capacity and then can grow, can scale quickly. The Switzerland factor we'll talk about in a moment, and the management team itself. Is it a quality management team that's up to the task? All of these are important correlations. So when it comes to profitability and profitability growth, we spoke about the concept of discounted cash flow. And discounted cash flow involves something we call the time value of money, meaning over time, money is worth less in the future because inflation erodes the value of it. So if we were to put $100 in the bank and earn 5% interest, we'd expect to have $105 at the end of that time frame. Well, the concept in determining value and using the profitability, or in this case, the cash flow of the company going forward, is a process we call discounting. And in discounting, what we do is we start with the future value. In this case, I'm going to point to it here, the $105, and we say that the present value of the $105 1 year hence, today at a 5% discount rate, is $100. So we just took the mathematical formula from which interest is derived and just reversed it. So now we have a discounting concept, a discount rate as opposed to an interest rate, and a way of discounting future cash flows to the present, which is how we in fact can compare values of different investments, and indeed how buyers value companies. Or if you want to value your own company even without a buyer, a valuation expert would use these tools in order to derive the value of your company. One final word before I move on about that discount rate. In this particular case, we were using 5%. The discount rate is the way in which buyers take into account the perceived risk of the investment. So if your company is perceived as fairly risky, they're going to attribute a much higher discount rate, which is, on the next slide I will show you, has a profound effect in terms of what those future cash flows look like when discounted back to the present. So let's take a look at a schedule. In this particular case, we have a 10-year horizon, and I'm going to get myself a different tool here so that we're going to start with year 1 here and go to year 10. And you'll notice that for each of those 10 years, we're assuming $100,000 per year pre-tax profit, okay? So we got a company that we expect to generate $100,000 per year in cash flow, or I'm interchanging profit and cash flow for purposes of this discussion, even though they're not exactly the same. But if we have level profits going forward, and we attribute, in this case, let's use a 15% discount rate, which for small businesses is frankly pretty low. This is the kind of discount rate you might discount a large company at. But let's assume we discount those $100,000 cash flows at 15%. When you add up the present value of each of those $100,000 profits, you end up at the bottom of the page that I'm highlighting now, a little over $500,000 of present value. So all things being equal, a buyer would value a company with $100,000 per year of cash flow at a perceived risk and cost of capital of 15% at $500,000. Now, I talked about the discount rate being the risk driver. Let's look at the next column on the right here. I'm highlighting. Let's pump that discount rate up to 50%. Now, I'm not suggesting that every small business is going to be discounted at that severe an interest rate or a discount rate. In fact, it probably would be more in the 30 to 35% range is typically what I see. But if you were to do that instead of the 15%, and now you go through and discount each of those $100,000 annual profits, now if you go to the very right-hand corner, lower right-hand corner of the chart here, that reduced the present value way down to below $200,000. So you can see just the same cash flow discounted at a different perceived risk makes a huge difference in terms of the perceived value of the company. $500,000 down to $200,000. Now let's take that a step further and go, instead of having a level $100,000 a year profitability, let's grow it at 20% per year. So now I'm highlighting we have grown $100,000 each of 10 years at 20%. So then now down in year 10, down here, that $100,000 has now grown to almost $620,000. Now if we go back to using that same 15% discount rate that we used on the previous slide and discount those cash flows growing at 20%, we now come to a whopping over $1.25 million valuation, or present value, which would then convert to the perceived value of this company at $1.25 million. And compare that to what we look like when we had level profits of $100,000, way more than twice. So as you can see, not only profitability but growth and profitability are profoundly important when it comes to valuing a company. So how do you grow a company? Well, we spoke briefly last month about, you can work on products which are on this dimension, or you can work on the market level. If you want to grow by what we call market penetration, then you're delivering more products, current products to a larger portion of your current market. You're increasing your market share in your current market. That's called market penetration. On the other hand, if you're going to stay in your current markets, but you're going to introduce new products, we refer to that as product development, another avenue for you to grow your profitability. If we are going to retain our current product mix but offer it to new markets, we call that market development. So that might involve going to a new geography from what you're currently operating in. And if you're doing both, introducing new products to new markets, we call that diversification. And so you get double leverage there if you can find a new product to introduce to a new market successfully. So, think about your company in terms of which of these quadrants that you could perhaps excel in, and any of them work. It's just a question of analyzing what's possible. Okay, the other thing we talked about in terms of growth had to do with what we call the Scalability Trifecta, the big three. We talked briefly about Jim Hyman, who introduced the quick oil change industry to the United States. And instead of being in the, when you think about the old days with a gas station and you needed your oil changed or they had a mechanic, he calls it John Warlaw calls it the break-fix syndrome, where something's broken, you take it to get fixed. He introduced this concept of a teachable, valuable, and repeatable business that took what we used to think of in this case of an oil change, where you go to a gas station, have your oil changed, to make it routine, relatively simple so that it could be taught to a workforce that didn't have a terribly high skill set, valuable to the automotive public, because as we all know, they drilled into our heads, get your oil changed every 3,000 miles. So it was certainly repeatable, and getting the oil change is probably the cheapest insurance you can get in terms of preserving the value of your automobile. So that was a perfect example of a business that was transformed from something that was more of a break-fix, one-off kind of a business to a teachable, valuable, and repeatable kind of a model that literally grew to thousands and thousands of locations around the country. So again, if you can think of your business in terms of creating that growth through redefining or taking apart your product offering in such a way that you can maybe peel off a teachable, valuable, and repeatable piece, it can do wonders for your growth, and it can obviously do wonders, therefore, for your profitability and your cash flow. The third thing we talked about last month, and then we'll move on to our next, what we're going to spend most of our time today with, is what John Warlaw refers to as the Switzerland structure, the fact that Switzerland remained sort of neutral and balanced through all of the world conflicts of the last century or two. And he refers to, in a business context, of the Switzerland structure referring to, don't get too concentrated in any of your key components of your business, the success drivers, customers, suppliers, and employees. So if you've got a customer base that's way too concentrated, your attractiveness to a possible buyer, or indeed for the risk of your own business just to increase the value, is huge, because if you lose that customer, you've put a pretty big dent in your revenue and your cash flow. So, we like to see in our practice no more than maybe 15, 20, at most 25%, but preferably lower, 15, maybe even 10% concentration in any one customer or customer group. Having a supply chain that's diverse and rich, where you have choice, so that you don't get tied up with any one supplier, so that they have some sort of price advantage over you. Kind of the opposite of what we were talking about when we're trying to achieve a monopoly position. You certainly don't want your supplier to be in that position, because he has pricing leverage then. And then finally, too much of a reliance on a key employee or two, where if they were to leave, would leave the company in the lurch, and especially if somebody's trying to buy the company, they're looking for, again, a broad, resilient key management team, so that they're not held hostage to any one or two employees leaving. So those are, Joan, that's the brief review of what we covered last month.
Right.
So shall we ask if anybody has any
questions? The conference has been unmuted.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions about the review, please feel free to ask that now. You're unmuted. If not, we'll just move forward.
Any questions? I covered that pretty fast.
And I think a few of our attendees have not called in. They're just doing it through their computer, so they may not have that ability.
Ah, got it.
So, yeah, so I would go ahead.
But they're hearing us nevertheless, presumably, right?
I hope so.
Okay, good. Okay. Well, if there are no
The
questions, then
conference
let's
has
go
been
ahead
muted.
Go ahead, Dale. Oops. Dale?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
I can talk now?
Yes.
Okay.
I had you muted.
Oh, okay. Okay, so now that we've looked at what we covered last month, the first 3 of these drivers, let's move on to the 4th, which has to do with cash flow. And we talked earlier about how value is determined by cash flow and the discounting of those future cash flows to the present. So obviously, improving cash flow is huge when it comes to value. So the first concept we're going to talk about is, well, the 2 are, I think we're actually going to talk about timing first, but it has to do with what is the timing of your cash inflows and outflows. Obviously, improving cash collection over outflows helps the cash profile of the company, and whether or not that cash is recurring once you've got a customer happens time and again without a whole lot of effort on your part to reacquire a customer, or whether it is one-off, and indeed that every time you want to enjoy some new revenue, you've got to get a new customer, can make a big difference. So let's look at each of those in a little more depth. So one of the things that happens when a company is being looked at by a possible acquirer is not only what are those cash flows, what do they look like, what is the cash profile, what are the inflows and outflow cycles, but if in fact the buyer potentially has to inject a lot of cash in order to support the operating cycle of the company, obviously that's going to have a detrimental effect on the valuation. So let's say, for example, otherwise a company was deemed to be worth $3 million, let's say, but if the seller were going to pull out all of the cash, then in order to support the working capital, i.e. the operating cycle of the company, the cash flow cycle of the company, that the buyer was then going to have to invest, let's say, $250,000, they are going to take the position that the net cost to them should be $2.75 million. They're not going to pay $3 million for the company and then inject another $250,000 to support the business going forward. So that would become a big negotiating item. So obviously, having a company whose cash flows are such that they don't require a lot of cash on the part of the buyer are going to be very attractive. And so again, thinking about your own cash flow cycles and how they impact the amount of cash that's needed at any given moment is going to weigh heavily on the buyer's perception of the value. And it's perceived value, right? We talked about that. There's risk, which is perceived. It is, even though valuation techniques are very sophisticated in many cases, at the end of the day, there's a lot of subjectivity associated with it. So cash flow, very important. Okay, let's talk about this concept of recurring revenue. So I have a client that is unfortunately in a situation where he's working with consumers, where it's unlikely that in any short period of time that his customers are going to need his services and products more than once, and maybe every 5-10 years, but certainly a long cycle. So his challenge is in his marketing and sales effort, is to constantly replenish this, I'll call it this revolving door of customers that he needs to feed the revenue generation capacity of his company. On the other hand, when you look at this list that I'm displaying now, think about these businesses and how built into the very nature of the business is a recurring revenue model. And these examples go from what I'll call the least to the most desirable. So obviously we all use toothpaste up and we have to go buy it. But of course, when you go buy toothpaste, you can buy any brand. So just because it's consumable and has potential recurring revenue doesn't mean that they're going to buy your particular brand again. So it's better to have something we call captive consumables, where in this case, for example, think of HP printers and how much ink they sell. In fact, some people have referred to Hewlett-Packard as the house that ink built, because the printers are sold at very, very low prices in order to get the ink business. So that's a little bit better than just the toothpaste example, because most people will buy the branded ink, even though others are available. The next best on my list here is the subscription model. And when you think about subscribing to a magazine, although that's getting to be less and less common these days, you are typically asked to pay for a year, two, or even maybe 3. They'll sometimes give you a discount if you'll commit to a longer period of time. But what happens is they're getting their cash up front from your subscription, and then only having to spend the money to deliver on that product, on that subscription over time. So it's a very attractive cash flow model in that it brings the cash in early. Even better than that is what we call captive subscriptions, which is like we talked a minute ago about captive consumables. Bloomberg is a financial information service that a lot of professional investment houses and advisors use. And in order to get their service, you have to get their terminal. And once you've got their terminal, then you're pretty much tied into buying their information services. So here we've got a really repeatable recurring revenue kind of model that's tied exactly into that particular brand, the Bloomberg product and service. Hard to substitute somebody else once you've invested in that technology. Then next, second to last, auto renewal contracts. Iron Mountain, you may be familiar, is a document storage company that is, I believe, nationwide. I've actually used them in my business. And here, you sign up for storing material, and which sometimes may be there for years and years and years. In fact, some people perhaps forget about it. And they get charged a monthly charge just for the rental of that space. So these things just, you don't even have to, re-up or renew. They simply enjoy your revenue because they either are just billing you or have your credit card or whatever. And it really is a powerful recurring revenue model, and therefore, again, makes Iron Mountain look like a very attractive acquisition candidate from a cash flow standpoint. Excuse me. Then, finally on our list, we have long-term contracts, such as we're all familiar with our wireless companies. And these, as you know, tie you up with a penalty, by the way, as we all know, for breaking the contract, for monthly fees. And again, very powerful, ties the customer to the company in ways that these other models do not. And so, as you think about your business, again, are you in any of these kinds of businesses where you do have some repeatable and recurring revenue? Or can you think of ways to modify, supplement, add to what you're already doing that might give you a component of recurring revenue within your current business model? Okay, let's move on. Degree of monopoly control. This is probably one of the most obvious that we could talk about. There's nothing worse than being in what we call a commodity business, where everybody seems to have an equally perceived product in the marketplace, where everybody's competing on price rather than value or quality. And if you are, then it's difficult to develop competitive advantage, to construct what we like to call barriers to entry to your business. I've got a client now that is in the professional services business, and their whole business model is built around the extraordinary experience and quality and outcome-driven service that they provide their clients. That's unmatched. And that has become a significant barrier to entry for this company. It may impede some of the growth because they have to add personnel that have that same characteristic as they grow, but it provides a very strong barrier to anyone else trying to come in, establish the relationships, and build that quality profile, that credibility profile with a client base. So they have grown very nicely within the current constraints of their infrastructure, and have built that protective moat, if you will, around their business to make it difficult for anyone else to penetrate. The mother of all of these barriers to entry is probably IP, intellectual property, where you can patent something, develop something that no one else can copy for a period of time, where you carve out that piece of the market all to yourself and effectively do have monopoly control. So now you have pricing authority in terms of how you price your product. And so achieving that for our businesses is very attractive. As I said earlier, you don't want your suppliers to be in that position. So how does low market share figure into this equation? Well, when a company has a product, and especially if it's one that's got protection, like a patent, for example, or other IP, it's the best position to be in, because now you've got this huge market that's totally unexploited. And small companies can grow rather rapidly without impacting the total market in any great way. Many years ago, when I was the CFO of Bank of America's technology division, they were talking about IBM's massive growth at the time. This was back in the late 70s and maybe even the early 80s. IBM was growing by leaps and bounds, but it was so big globally that people were looking at that growth curve and saying, there's no way that IBM can continue to grow at this pace for very long, because it would totally consume the entire gross product of, gross global product of the earth at the rate it was growing. So it was hard to tell why they would not be able to grow, but it was pretty clear that they couldn't. And sure enough, as we know later, IBM totally redefined itself and slowed its growth profile down considerably. But when you're small, on the other hand, you really do have the opportunity to take advantage of a market that's virtually untapped. And if you're $1 million, $5 million company, to get to 10 or 20 or 40 or even 100 is a lot easier than if you're a $100 million company trying to go to 3, 4, or 500 million. So getting that pricing authority and having a defensible market position with a niche product is an ideal situation. And so all of us should constantly be thinking about, is there a way that we can redefine or repackage or supplement what we already have with products that have these characteristics in the marketplace? Customer satisfaction, number 7 of our 8 drivers. I don't think anyone would disagree that customer satisfaction is paramount. It's been pounded into our heads by business experts for decades, and we all strive to do better with customer satisfaction. But a fellow by the name of Fred Reicholt at Bain & Company came up with an idea that I want to share with you in a moment. But let's talk a little bit about growth and customer satisfaction. Earlier I mentioned the fact that's totally obvious to all of us, I suppose, that retaining a customer is easier than acquiring a new one. The cost is far lower, but customer retention has to do with sustained customer relationships. Happy customers that are, you've heard that term, raving fans. The long-term profitability and growth of that profitability, having those customer relationships are fundamental to maintaining that profitability. But how do you build that loyalty? And how do you find out how your customers feel to begin with? Most of us don't actively go out and solicit feedback in terms of how we're doing, because you do want those sustainable positive interactions over time to drive the profitability and value of your company. And even today especially, they used to say, I don't know what the ratio was, that even before the internet, that somebody has a bad experience, you'll tell 7 people. If you have a good experience, maybe 1 or 2. So the leverage is totally against you if customers are having bad experiences. But that dynamic has been multiplied and is on steroids with the internet. Think of Yelp and how that has very much publicized what people think of their vendors, their suppliers, their providers. And it was, as we speak, my wife and I are actually looking for a retirement home for my mother, and in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it is astounding what we're seeing in terms of what people have to say about some of these facilities. And I can't imagine that they're not looking at these, but really, really does drive customer perception. So with the internet, especially, having satisfied customers is so, so important. But again, we don't measure this profitability. And so this fellow from Bain & Company that I was referring to earlier developed a scheme or a scoring system that I want to talk about for a minute. You may have heard of it. It's called the Net Promoter Score. And it's actually used by many, many large corporations. And in fact, a friend of mine who's the CEO of a company, a national company, is on the board of a nonprofit with me, and we have now introduced it into the nonprofit. This has become a big deal. So here's how it works. So you only ask one question. I mean, you may bury it in other questions, but the one question that you're really curious about getting the answer for is this one. How likely is it that you would recommend your company, in this case, to a friend or a colleague? Recommend, not just like and keep it to yourself, but actually be so excited and thrilled about your experience with this customer that you're going to actually recommend it to someone else. And as you can see on the scale that we have here, the promoter category is only the top two on the index, 9 and 10. To be a promoter in this scheme, you have to actually get a 9 or a 10. Most of us would consider that to be a pretty high bar. If you're merely a 7 or 8 in this scheme, you're deemed to be passive, and in fact are not even going to impact the ultimate score, which is surprising. Most of us would probably think 7 or 8 ain't bad. And then the rest, all the way from 0 to 6 on this scale, are referred to as detractors. And you're looking at 5 or 6 and you're thinking, well, wait a minute, that's kind of middle of the road. Why is that a detractor? Well, not only is it a detractor, it's going to count against us, but we don't even get to count our 7 or 8 in our score. And the score is calculated as follows. You take the total survey response, and let's say you have 100 people respond, and you take the percentage of that 100 that gave you a 9 or a 10, and you subtract the percentage of that 100 that gave you anywhere from a 0 to a 6. So you've got 6 chances to subtract and only 2 to add. And that percentage then is used to develop your Net Promoter Score. So a high positive rating based on all of the samples and all the people who are using this is in the 50 to 80% range, meaning you've got to have a net 50% people rating you at a 9 or a 10 compared to those who are rating you a 0 to a 6. And some actually get up to 80 and plus. And average firms, based on this scheme, are coming in at about 5 to 10%, meaning that if you're at 5 to 10%, you're not even scratching the surface. You're not at all positive. The great companies, and we'll look at a couple in a minute, that score high on this Net Promoter Score index you'll recognize as, I mean, think in your own mind, what are just some great companies out there that you just think are fabulous? They'll probably be on this list. So obviously a negative score is even worse than the 5 to 10% because now your detractors are far outweighing your promoters. And that is obviously not going to be good for all the reasons we talked about. So what does a high Net Promoter Score mean to you if you were to engage in this survey process? Well, obviously, with these very satisfied customers who are recommending others, they're doing their marketing for you, will obviously generally increase profits. And because the referral process is working in your favor, you may well spend less on marketing. You get to sort of pick and choose your new customers because instead of you chasing them, many of them may be coming to you. And these companies that do well are better able to plan their growth strategies. It becomes a key component of how they're going to grow and makes the strategic planning a good deal easier. So let's take a look at a couple of companies that you might recognize. Over here, remember we talked about the 5 to 10% being sort of the average. But here's a bank. Here's a company, Wegmans. I believe that's a chain store, but certainly not in Northern California. USAA is a insurance company that caters to, I believe, the armed forces. Very highly regarded company. Look at these scores they're achieving. They're up in the 70, 80% range. Here's Costco, the big box store that many of us probably use. Apple Computer. Publix is a big supermarket chain in the Southeast. Amazon. Kohl's department store. These are companies that customers think a great deal of. And with net promoter scores like this are enjoying a good many referrals and recommendations from their current customers, which is a great driver of profitability and growth, as we said. Other companies, Zappos, another one that rates very highly. Another one, Vanguard Mutual Fund Group, it ranks very highly. So you may think of others that probably rank high, but it's an elite group and one that you with your company, if you can get these scores up, could do a great deal for your valuations of your company. The final driver that we're going to speak about, and I have a few comments after we get done with these 8, so I think we're on track to get done at about the right amount of time here. It's called hub and spoke. And I use this term, are you at the center of your solar system? The sun in our solar system gives life to everything. And if you're that sun in your company, if you give life to everything, then to what extent is a buyer going to want to buy your company without you there? This kind of goes back to that professional services firm I was talking about earlier, which had constructed some great barriers to entry. But at the same time, if they were to sell their company and all leave, what would be left? All the customer relationships would be gone. So they got a two-edged sword there. They got great barriers to entry, but they've got a difficult time, I think, looking at selling their business. So are you the star salesperson? Oftentimes in small companies, the founder, the CEO, is the best salesman in the company. So if you're growing a sales culture and additional men and women in your company that can help you sell, obviously is something that's very desirable from an acquirer's point of view. And again, the management team itself. Is there a good bench there? Are there systems and processes in place? Is there a business model that people understand that can carry on after you've left the business post-acquisition? Because again, depending on the situation, an acquirer might have a management team that they're going to install, and all they're buying is your customers. But if they're relying on management expertise in your company, then you can't be the only one that brings the value. Before we go into the next segment, let me check the next slide here. I want to make sure I've said everything I want to say about hub and spoke. Yeah. Before we do that, Joan, maybe we should open the lines up again and ask if anyone has any questions at this point.
Okay.
The conference has been unmuted.
Any questions on what Dale has covered so far on the value drivers?
I was just hoping he could repeat how to figure out that promoter index.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go back to that slide while I talk about it. It's a simple mathematical calculation.
Okay.
So you've got a 1 to 10 scale. You ask your customers, how likely would you be to recommend a friend or colleague to my company, 10 being the most likely and 0 meaning the least likely. And then they choose on that scale of 1 to 10. the percentage of those responding, and again I used 100 to make the math easy, so 9 to 10. Let's say it's 60%. Okay, respond 9 to 10. They really love you. 60% of your customers, and let's say only 10% of them rate you 0 to 6, or are detractors. Okay, then you take the 60% who gave you a 9 or 10, and you subtract the 10% that gave you the 0 to 6, and that leaves you with what? 50%, right?
Yes.
That would be your Net Promoter Score, and that's a pretty good one.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions?
I think that's all we have.
Okay, so let's move on.
The conference has been muted.
Okay, Dale, you're unmuted now.
Okay. This is the exercise I referred to at the beginning of our webinar that I would encourage you to engage in on your own time. But take those 8 sellability or value drivers. We talked about profit and profit growth and the Switzerland structure. Hopefully you make notes about those, the hub and spoke, the customer satisfaction, all of those. And after having attended these 2 sessions, write down the 2 most impactful areas that you can work on or that need improvement to increase your score. I know you perhaps haven't got your score yet, and you've been invited. Joan informs me that everybody's been invited to take this Sellability Index score after having registered for the webinar, and I encourage you to do so. But even before you do, or after, write down the 2 that you think could use the most improvement. And then, after having done that, in each of those 2 areas, write down 3 concrete initiatives that you could undertake to make measurable progress so that if you were to actually get those done, your score would improve. So it could be profitability, it could be identifying a teachable, repeatable, valuable kind of a service, it could be improving your cash flow cycle in some way. And how would you do that? How could you, for example, if you were in a business that it took time to deliver a product, let's say like a construction company, and most of them do this anyway, but let's assume for the moment they don't, collect progress payments. So you don't wait till the very end where you're spending all your money on materials and labor, and then finally at the very end, invoice the customer. Figure out ways to accelerate that cash flow. Those are examples of what you might do to improve that particular driver, the cash flow driver. But I think we've given you enough of these that there's probably opportunity for everyone to make some improvement in one of these areas. So after we're done, do yourself a favor, sit down, spend some time thinking about these things, and go through this exercise. I think it'll be helpful for you. Mm-hmm. So let's spend the last few minutes going over some what I'll call final thoughts and insights. As Joan said, I've been involved in a lot of transactions and helped advise companies in buying and selling and done it myself. And I think I can offer some perspective here. There are 4 concepts here that I want to talk about. The concept of a strategic buyer, something that, again, John Warlaw, I'm borrowing a lot of his stuff here from his book, the Starnish line, he calls it. We'll talk about the Sellability Index, which we mentioned a minute ago, that you can actually calculate for your own company, or that the system will. And what are the consequences of not increasing your Sellability Index? Let's talk about these areas for a moment. So the strategic versus the financial buyer. Now, remember the discounted cash flow models we went through. We looked at how the future cash flows of a business can be discounted back to a present value and create the financial value of the company. But lots of companies are bought for premiums over and above their raw financial value because they have strategic value of some sort or another to a potential acquirer. And so A large company example that I like to use is when it was called SBC at the time. It's now AT&T. When they bought Bell South a number of years ago, they paid a huge premium over the financial value of the company because it had a great deal of strategic value to them. Not only did it increase the national footprint that at the time that AT&T was trying to create with the southeastern United States, but perhaps even more importantly, Bell South owned 50% of the wireless company that AT&T, again at the time it was called SBC, owned. So by buying Bell South, not only did they increase their national footprint and all those customers, but they got total control of the most valuable asset within the telecommunications industry. That's the wireless franchise, which is where all the growth is, as we all know. So that is a perfect example of buying something for way more than its pure financial value. Well, what's the analog or the lesson for us? Well, it's let's look for strategic buyers. Let's look for ways to be strategic to potential acquirers. And that's part of what Joan does in her business, is help customers look for those kind of buyers that will enjoy a much higher price than just the pure financial valuation.
Mm-hmm.
So again, what kinds of things do these strategic buyers look for? Leverage, operating leverage, financial leverage, scale. Are you again, we're small businesses, and scale is something we probably don't talk a lot about when we're in our size. But how do you get this multiplier effect by being able to increase your cash flow and your profitability over and above what we might call a linear growth? Can you develop a process that's more productive, that delivers more output for given input? And then a lot of times strategic buyers will be scanning the landscape for possible acquisition candidates, and sometimes we'll actually come up with an unsolicited offer. I want to spend a minute here in a second talking about that. So let's talk about, remember I talked about that thing called the Starnish line, S-T-A-R-N-I-S-H, that John Warlaw term. And what he's talking about there is if you were really wanting to sell a business and wanted to, take off, go to the tropics and sip Mai Tais, totally disengaged from the business, you're viewing this transaction as a finish line for you. But bear in mind that the acquirer is looking at this whole thing as the starting line for them. And so being careful not to really focus on the fact that you're leaving, and in some cases may want to even dangle the carrot to the buyer that you'll stick around for a while. But the fact of the matter is, based on a 2012 survey by the Built to Sell folks, you can see, if you can read that by far and away, most of the sellers of companies stay around for less than 12 months. In fact, when you add this up, we got 30%, 55%, about 60, 70%, roughly 70% of sellers of businesses only stay around for 12 months or less. And most of those even less than 6 months. Anybody who's talking about staying, 3 years, 2-3 years, a very small percentage. And so the question is, what's realistic, and how much are you willing to stick around in order to maximize the value to the prospective buyer? And again, as a practical matter, it looks like not many people are willing to stick around very long. And not surprising, particularly if it's a larger organization. Entrepreneurs are used to being their own boss. It's hard to go back into a structured environment where you're not calling all of the shots. So the Sellability Index, we talked about it briefly earlier, and all of you are going to have an opportunity, if you choose to engage in this. But it measures your ability to sell business at a premium price based on how you score on all of those 8 drivers of value we talked about. And they're weighted based on a 1,200 company sample that the Built to Sell folks went through. And not only did they just do that and did all these correlations, But then they took it to the mergers and acquisitions industry that specializes in these kinds of size companies, and had them take a look at it, and they made some additional tweaks to the weightings as a result of that, and came up with this final algorithm that's patented that tells you, the business owner, where will you get the best return on your time and money resources going after these drivers. Which drivers are you weak in? And the Sellability Index is an absolutely perfect way to get a very quick assessment of how you stand on these 8 drivers. And again, that's important not only because of that fact, but tells you where to spend your time and energy so you'll get the most effective return on that time that you spend trying to develop your value. So, lastly, avoid these pitfalls. I think sometimes sellers are too quick to want to sell, or really haven't built their value and are settling for a lower price than they really deserve. I was just in England about 3 weeks ago working with a client, and met with a friend who had an accounting practice. They're chartered accountants in England, and he was lamenting the fact that he sold kind of during the downturn, during the financial crisis, when valuations were very low. Mm-hmm. And he's now regretting having sold it at the price he sold. So you don't want to have that happen. He worked all his life to build up this accounting practice, and has been disappointed in what it delivered. Longer due diligence. You know, the crisper your financials are, and the clearer your value proposition is, and the clearer your growth strategy is, the more clear it is to a buyer that you're worth what you say you're worth. And I've been through them all, and Joan will probably give you 100 times more war stories than I have about the horrible process of answering questions and funneling information to a prospective buyer on every possible detail of the business.
It's not for the faint of heart, right?
Oh gosh. and it just gives them ammunition to do what we call on this next bullet point, shrinkage, where they come back. You know, they give you a sense of, if you were here on the first session, we talked about a case study where, you know, the letter of intent came in at one number, and by the time they got done with their due diligence, they had shrunk the cash flows of the company, and therefore, the present value of the business, substantially from what the expectation was on the part of the seller. And so having more solid numbers and defensible numbers obviously can help with that. And then, of course, the seller's remorse. Should I have sold it all? Did I sell at the right price? And how to best do that. And I'm going to just make a bald-faced plug for Joan and her company now. You need a professional advisor to help you through this process, because people like Joan, and to a lesser extent myself, she's in this business full-time, are able to help you through not only these quantitative issues that we've been talking about, but the emotional roller coaster that inevitably accompanies selling a business. But again, this isn't just about selling a business. You know, we all ought to want to increase the value of our business, because it's going to increase the money we have in our pocket at the end of the day. So I see we're coming right up on 3 o'clock, and if I'm not mistaken, whoops, we got one more slide. So, Joan, you can weigh in too. Don't rush. Slow down.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Don't sign until the fine print's been discussed. Too many people, the devil's in the details. Mm-hmm. Don't tell your employees, get representation. Joan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that I probably discourage more than encourage most sellers who I talk to about their timing, because they may say, oh yeah, I think I want to sell my business, but the deeper we get into it, you know, if you're not pretty sure about what you're going to do after the sale or the acquisition of your company, if you don't really have, you know, that each week you come into business and aren't thinking, gosh, it's time, because your mind will change many times during the process. You know, is this worth going through all this? So I kind of give you some I'd be more than glad to talk to any of you about some of the things to ask yourself to make sure the timing is right and your business is positioned. And Dale, I just want to give your company a plug for anyone who, once they take the sellability score and see, wow, I'm kind of at the lower level of getting more than just the average multiple for my business, and you know you have 2 or 3 more years that you'd like to build it, the alternative board or competitive advantage group puts you on a board of other CEOs of different industries, not your own, and you have the expertise of 7 to 10 other people and a wonderful facilitator to be able to learn from and be able to grow. And Dale, I don't know if I've talked to you, but I've spoken to quite a few of your board members, and they just said their business would not be where they are today without the alternative board, that it's just been
well, that's very kind of them.
Yeah, and measurable.
And by the way, the competitive advantage part of what we do is consulting and can help with hands-on activities that, you know, if those areas are identified, so roll up your sleeves and help you get it done kind of stuff as well, in addition to the alternative board part, which is the peer advisory boards. But thank you for the plug,
Absolutely.
and thank you everyone for tuning in. I hope this was valuable to you, and I hope you take the Sellability Index. And if you do, you'll be hearing
The conference
from
has been unmuted.
If you do take the Sellability Index, you will hear from me in terms of going over the report with you and identifying those areas where you might be able to improve the value of your company. So with that, Joan, unless there are any other questions, I guess we ought to throw it open one last time. I'm done with my part.
Thank you, Dale, so much for your insight, and I think I get quite a few of these back every week, and people are kind of, well, in some areas they're going, yeah, I'm not surprised that's low because of the way they answer the questions, but I think it's been very helpful. Any last question before we sign off for today? Okay, thank you so much for being here, and Dale, thank you for your being our chairperson and giving us a great webinar. We will be sending everybody a notice next month for our next webinar. We do these monthly, so feel free to jump on, or feel free to call Dale or myself with any questions about today. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Please stand by.